Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Librairie D+Q's virtual fall event series. I'm Rachel, and I'm delighted to introduce and host our event tonight with Anne Helen Petersen. I'd like to take this time first to recognize that our publishing offices and bookstores are located on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. While many of us refer to our home here as Montreal, it is named Tiohtià:ke, and we are grateful that creating and sharing stories has been a part of this land for thousands of years. I encourage you to look into the Indigenous history of wherever you're tuning in from, as well as the ways that those around you are organizing in pursuit of decolonization and justice. I'm also glad to announce that both of our bookstores are currently open for physical browsing, and we continue to monitor the situation closely every day. We're still offering also safe and secure curbside pickup and free shipping in Quebec for orders over $39, and we ship Canada-wide. We encourage you to take advantage of these services as we look forward to warmly welcoming you once more. So thank you so much for joining us here and supporting local independent bookstores like ours. It's really because of your support that we're able to keep our doors open and continue to offer free events such as this one. And we're currently also hosting 9 different digital book clubs for young readers and adults monthly, sort of. You can find us on Facebook for more details, and it's a great chance to connect and talk about books if that's something you've been missing over the past few months. So to introduce myself, my name is Rachel Wallace. I'm a bookseller here at Drawn and Quarterly, and I'm also a researcher and analyst who's studied topics such as care work, childcare, and the gender wage gap. With regards to tonight's event, I'll also let you know that I'm a young millennial. So this means that I'm old enough to have played in the streets when I was a kid and young enough that the iPhone came out while I was still in high school. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest of honor, Anne Helen Petersen. A former senior culture writer for BuzzFeed, Anne Helen Petersen now writes her newsletter, Culture Study, as a full-time venture on Substack. And it's great, you should read it. Petersen received her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, where she focused on the history of celebrity gossip. Her previous books, Too Fat, Too Slutty, Too Loud, and Scandals of Classic Hollywood, were featured in NPR, Elle, and The Atlantic. She lives in Missoula, Montana. So without further ado, welcome to the launch of Can't Even.
Hi, I have actually the UK version because I just sent my last copy of my own book away to a friend, but I'm so excited to be here.
Great, thanks so much for joining us. So to start off, I just wanted to ask if you could give us a brief overview of the book. What is Burnout? Why is it a defining millennial experience? And who are millennials, for anyone in the audience who is unsure?
So I'll start with millennials just because I think that's like a good term setting from the beginning. Because I think sometimes millennial is used to describe anyone who's young. When, I'm an elder millennial, I'm 39. Most millennials are married or near marrying age or partnered, long-term partnered, have kids, like, all the things that we associate with people in their 30s, like that's millennials. And I started thinking and writing about burnout because I burned out and I refused to recognize it. This is actually right about 2 years ago. I had been reporting on the American midterms really doggedly, but also in between there, like had been called off the political trail to cover a mass shooting in Texas, and then had spent a week reporting on members of a fundamentalist cult in southern Utah, and like the women who had returned to this small town after escaping from the cult, like a lot of really intense reporting. And I started just like getting mad at my editors. Every time that they edited me, I'd be like crying. It was not my style. And my editor said to me, like, I think you're burnt out. And I said, how dare you, right? Because to me, my ability to work all the time, to like push through points of exhaustion, like that was my calling card. That was the thing that distinguished me and made me a better worker. And so I really rejected that idea. Also, I had taken off 2 whole days after the election, and I had gotten a massage and a facial. So clearly I could not be burnt out because I was practicing self-care. This is absolutely wrong. But the thing that I did recognize was that I couldn't get through my to-do list. Like every week there were these things on my to-do list, really simple, straightforward things. Take my shoes to the cobbler, mail a package, get registration for my dog, like simple things that I just could not bring myself to do. And so I said, oh, I will figure out like what my errand paralysis is. That was what I called it. I was like, I have errand paralysis. What's going on? And as I researched that, which is how I deal with problems, and this is my training as an academic, is that I try to like analyze them and research them. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm totally burnt out. And the problem was that I didn't recognize what I was experiencing as burnout because I thought burnout was something that happened to like healthcare workers, social workers, people who are working in war zones where you really physically collapse because of the amount of stress and work has become so overwhelming. And instead, what I was experiencing was just this dull background noise of exhaustion. That idea that I was unstable and that in order to stabilize myself in some way, I would work all the time. So confronting precarity, economic precarity, job precarity, all these things through the remedy of spreading work into every corner of my life and making myself into a work robot as efficiently as possible. And as I started thinking about that and researching the causes and how I had internalized those ideas, a lot of those experiences seemed things that had so much to do with being a millennial and so much to do with where my generation graduated into the Great Recession and the aftermath and the amounts of student debt that our generation has taken on and just the general feeling of falling behind and struggling to keep up that I think animates a lot of millennial responses. So I wrote an essay for BuzzFeed in January 2019, and I thought that it would be fine, like do okay. Like I thought it would be like a personal essay that did okay. And it ended up going viral in a way that I have never experienced before. I think 8 million people ended up reading it, and it was translated into Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish, and French, and eventually Chinese, and went all over the place. And it was really straightforward to try to think about how could I expand what was largely a personal essay into something that looked horizontally in terms of like, what are all of the other experiences of burnout that really try to decenter my white middle class experience, but also look vertically in terms of looking historically at what are the different parenting trends and economic trends and ideological trends that really informed how we got to where we are today. So that's a long answer, but that's the story.
Great, thanks so much. One of the things I wanted to talk about, especially for this launch in Montreal, one of the things that comes up as a common experience in the book is not being able to have hobbies as a common trait among interview subjects, which when I moved to Montreal, everyone was like, what's cool about Montreal? And I was like, people have hobbies here. I've never seen it before. People do things for fun and they don't try and make money off of them. They just do them. But then over the past 4 years that I've lived here, there's been a housing crisis in the city, and I've seen that quite quickly sort of start to drop off as all of a sudden people's expenses and precarity are increasing. So I thought in relation to the book, could you talk more about the way that workplace changes, but also non-workplace factors are having an impact on these experiences of burnout that millennials are having?
So first of all, I love that that is the case with Montreal to some extent, because that is also the case with Missoula, where I live in Montana. It is a place where someone told me a couple years ago, like no one moves here to work. And what that means is no one is like, I want to move to Missoula and then I want to work all the time. And it's because it is this place of incredible beauty with incredible access to the outdoors. Like, no, there are so many hobbies that people can have. You can fish all the time, you can hunt all the time, you can ski all the time, you can hike all the time, like all of these things, these options that are available to people. And I do know people who really like have oriented their lives around these hobbies. And sometimes they spend a lot of money on these hobbies. And sometimes, but there's not really a way to monetize hiking. You know what I mean? Like there isn't, you can't use it as something that unless you're like guiding or something. But a lot of people work in order to live instead of live in order to work. So they find jobs that make it possible for them to continue to live in Missoula. And the problem is that a lot of those jobs are uh, paid poorly, precarious in various ways. They're seasonal jobs. They are minimum wage jobs. They are jobs that really fluctuate according to the amount of tourists that are in the area. And so with COVID, right, like that's a big concern. And we also are dealing with an affordable housing crisis that is making it even more hard for people to make ends meet. And I know that this is the case in various places in Canada as well, that people from cities are moving to these places that they can actually afford a home. And then the people who actually live there and work there are struggling to keep their homes and keep their affordable housing. And it creates a big tension. So I'm like, oh, well, I moved to Missoula and I work all the time and I was able to figure out housing. But these people who actually like have cultivated a really vibrant personal life, now they have to hustle in order to somehow make it work. So yeah, like this isn't something that's just uniquely about if you as a college kid learned how to work all the time. Some people who had figured out non-burnout strategies are now succumbing to them. And I know everyone that I know who had like formed some sort of discipline with their digital devices pre-COVID is backsliding, right? Like all of my digital hygiene is just gone to crap.
Yeah, very much. I think, yeah, there's been a lot of talk about how, the work home boundaries are slipping, but I think I've also seen, social home boundaries are slipping. I'm not meeting up with my friends at a certain time. So we're just kind of like sometimes talking all the time during the day, kind of.
Right. Well, and I think that there's so much work involved. There shouldn't be, right, in forming community, but like community formation in contemporary life has become a form of work. Like the classic trying to set plans and like everyone's like, I can't do it that night, I can't do it that night, I can't do it that night. And you end up setting plans for like 3 months in the future. And then the night before everyone cancels, like that sort of, or like the relief, like there's people who talk about on Twitter and there's memes and all this sort of thing of like the relief of canceling plans. It shouldn't be that way. Like the reason that we don't want to hang out with each other is because we're so tired. When you are not working all the time and when you aren't so desperate for some corner of your life that is your own, then you can make more time to authentically hang out with your actual friends, right? It's not something that you resent or feel like is another thing on your to-do list. It's companionship, it's friendship. Same thing with participating in like community organizations, whether it's your church or like a group or, all these sorts of things that have become increasingly rare in contemporary society. It's because there's so many other things vying for our time, and almost all of them are related in some capacity to work or to our children and like prepping them for what we think is the road to stability.
Mhm. Yeah, which then is often a road to work and maybe overwork. Yeah. I see that there's some questions coming into the Q&A. Just to let everyone know, Anne and I will talk for another 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to audience questions. So we will visit your questions in a short while.
Yeah, feel
Yeah.
free to keep putting them in there.
Yeah. So I wanted to circle back. You mentioned when describing your burnout experience, you had your 2 days of self-care where you went to the spa. And I was pleasantly surprised by how little self-care came up in your book. I think just a couple of times in interview quotes. And I think it's because I've been so conditioned to expect every conversation about burnout to be just a conversation that segues into. So that's why it's so important to take care of yourself. I
Yeah.
remember um, one of my employers once hosted a workshop on burnout for employees that was like 25% here's what burnout is, and then 75% here are some self-care strategies. And then we went home with coloring sheets.
So there wasn't any discussion of like, here's what might be happening in our workplace that might be causing this burnout.
Like a little bit, but it was described very much as like, this is all inevitable stuff that we just have to deal with, and self-care is our one and only tool to deal with that.
Well, so here's the problem is that I think burnout is a symptom of capitalism. When capitalism is crappiest, burnout is at its worst, right? And we have had periods in the past when capitalism has been more and less regulated, and things have been slightly better. And like there's still burnout in countries that are democratic socialist countries. Like I talked to this ended up getting cut from the book, but there were a lot of conversations that I had with people in Denmark about like some of the parenting burnout that they have. They're like, we have everything so much better than basically anyone else in the world, right? Like our nation has taken care of so many of the more difficult and precarious components of parenting. And yet, because of like global competition and gender norms and all these other sorts of things, there's still crap, right? Like there's still crap. So it's interesting because I think on one hand, we're never going to cure it entirely, never going to cure these problems entirely. But some of the times I think we have resorted, because the problem feels so big, to these like very individualized, very temporary band-aids. And self-care is a huge one. It's like, if you can figure out some serums for your face, like if you can get the right mask for you and feel good about like spending time and energy and money on yourself, then somehow you will feel better about like being exploited and mistreated at work and feeling like you're desperate to find employment that's more stable. Like this is not going to fix it. It's going to make you feel a little bit better. And actually, if it's like my facial, like I hadn't had a facial in a really long time. I've had like 3 in my life. And I think I had built up this hope that like somehow it would be very clarifying and like cathartic or feel really good. I don't know. It felt fine. So you're like, oh, I spent all this money on this self-care thing and I still feel the same. So it makes you feel like you're a failure at self-care to some extent. So I think that what I really wanted to do with the book was try to look at these larger structural problems so that when we're thinking about this, like, of course, take care of yourself. Absolutely sleep more, all of those basic things that we know. But you can't actually start changing those things until the larger structures are addressed as well.
Totally. This is a great segue into the next question I was going to ask, which is very much about larger structural problems. So we've been seeing in Canada and the US both women dropping out of the labor force in completely unprecedented numbers right now. And a lot of them are talking about childcare responsibilities as the main factor driving those decisions. We're hearing, like you mentioned in your Substack piece a couple weeks ago, it's called the first female recession. A few people in Canada are trying to make she-session happen as the first of this. And so people are sensationalizing this as a new thing, but in a lot of ways, it's just an amplification of what you're talking about in the final chapter of your book that talks about exhausted millennial parents. So do you think we're learning new things about the gender dynamics of burnout as we see this situation with COVID unfolding? And do you think that there's changes coming for what burnout looks like with this shift in what our workforce dynamics are?
Huge and important question. I mean, I think that like the interesting thing about what's happening with women leaving the workforce right now is that that is a symptom of how undervalued women have been in the workplace before, right? It's like the reason so many of the women that I talked to left the workplace or significantly reduced their hours, it's because they were making less than their partner. And so if all of these women are making less than their partners, what does that tell us? First of all, what does that tell us also about what becoming a mother does to your earning capabilities? And then when these women do drop out of the workforce, what that means is like we in the aftermath, like as these women try to rejoin the workforce or stay out of it altogether, it's just going to continue to exacerbate that divide, right? So it's illuminating a problem that was pre-existing, and then it's going to, as we move forward over the course of the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, make it even worse. So, I mean, I hope that like with so many things right now, what we're actually seeing is very clarifying, right? It's impossible to ignore who the most vulnerable populations are in this moment, or even with burnout. Like, I think it was something that people maybe acknowledged, but didn't like really completely understand, or were like, everyone else is doing fine. The economy is fine. Like, I should be fine. You can't continue to tell yourself that story. So if we can actually, I think, be very honest and look clearly at the problems that we're seeing, instead of looking away from them again and again, or distracting ourselves from them, then I hope we can have some change. But I think that involves some concentration and some consolidated anger. Like, I hope that in our rush to go back to normal, whenever that is, 9 months, a year, longer, that we won't be so excited that we forget the very real problems that have become visible during this time.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, and those stories of like, oh yeah, everyone's fine, are so seductive. Even reading the book, which is by and large a critique of everything that's going on right now, every so often I would read someone's testimonial and I would be like, oh, they're doing all that, should I be doing all that? Like, and I had to interrupt myself and go, that's absolutely not the point here. And I know it, but there's just some instinct that I've
Was it
developed.
like which part, like parts where people were talking about like their leisure, or parts that are talking about like their hustle, that you were like, I wanted?
So I'm like, oh, people do that many things in a day. Like, why didn't I try and fit more in?
It's so internalized, right? That like you hear someone talk, you hear someone talking about their bad habits that are clearly bad, or destructive, and you're like, oh well, I wish like I could be like that, right? Like I could adopt those habits, and it's desirable even though it's messed up.
Yeah. So yeah. Um, yeah, I was thinking also about the people. So you talk a lot about in the book about graduating into the recession, which was the experience for most of the older cohort of millennials. Um, and now the youngest millennials and moving into Gen Z largely, we have another group of people that is now graduating into a recession and entering the workforce during the recession. Do you think that there's things that you've learned in your research that are useful for this new cohort to resist some of the things that have led to burnout? And like, are there ways, everyone's so precarious right now, are there ways to still try and maintain your healthy boundaries when you're desperate for a job?
Right.
Um,
Ugh.
where's the resistance? Where's the hope?
Well, there's two things. First of all, I think like a lot of there was so much denigration of millennials that went on leading up to and then after the recession of being like, oh, they just moved to their parents' basements or whatever. And there's a lot of Gen Z that are in their parents' basements right now, either because they're taking classes from there or they need to be someplace that's more safe, that they don't have roommates, that sort of thing. And so I think like one thing to be very vigilant about is not, I don't know, making jokes about that or translating that into some sort of like method of saying that they're lazy, because it's just not the case. The other thing is that I think that Gen Z is just so much more willing to see these problems as structural instead of like blaming themselves as individuals for their failure. The amount of people in the book and many, many, many more interviews that it conducted that are not included in the book, but the number of people who really saw their inability to get steady employment during and after the recession as a personal failure. Like they are somehow, I'm not living up to my potential. Like I am a failure. I'm going to, like, it's my fault that I took out all these loans. Like every decision I made was wrong. Just incredible amounts of internalized ideas about what they did and didn't do. And Gen Z, I think, is like, no, this is the problem, right? Like there are these structures that are the problem. Like the government is the problem. And that I think is the truth, or is true both in terms of like in America with gun legislation, but also globally with environmental issues. And like you can't be like, oh, I personally am not recycling enough, which is a very millennial thing to do, right? It's like, I should try better to eat more local. Like that is a millennial understanding of the work that you need to do. And whereas I think a lot of Gen Zers are like, we need to dismantle like capitalistic forces that are gobbling up our resources and dooming our planet to an early death. So I'm hopeful about that they do see the structural problems more. And I think millennials started to see it. I was looking at an engram. It's a tool in Google that tracks like usage in books of different language. It's basically just like tracking how much we use words over the course of centuries sometimes. And capitalism was not something, and I even remember this, was not something that like you evoked outside of my graduate school classroom. Like when I was talking to my normal friends, I wouldn't be like, oh, well, and then capitalism did this, right? Like that was a very radical way to talk. And then the engram shows that post-recession, that usage of capitalism is just, because I think it's impossible not to identify capitalism as one of the main roots of the problem here. And so I hope that, and I see this on TikTok all the time too, like Gen Zers who are like evoking the ills of capitalism as part of the problem. So I'm hopeful about that.
Yeah, I think too, I'll add in my younger millennial perspective here. So I graduated high school right after the 2008 recession. And so I think I've seen with a lot of my peers, all of us have known the word recession the entire time we've been adults, and it's like, and it's something that people have worried about, and like, will there be another one, and what's it going to do, because we've heard how bad it was for people who are just a little bit older than us. And so I think that awareness of capitalism did start to sneak in, but I think at the same time there was still a strong narrative of like, oh yeah, that one recession when like people made some bad decisions and they went badly. And it's been a slow sort of creep towards, oh, like in general culture, like, oh, capitalism actually exists more than just from 2008 to 2010.
Well, and I think that one thing that millennials have that you're pointing to is, especially older millennials, is we have conditioned ourselves towards precarity. So most people that I know were just waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? Like the economy is going good, it's going to go to crap any second. And like we were just kind of waiting. So when the pandemic hit, it was like, of course, right? Like stability doesn't stay. And I think that that's actually, it has long lasting psychological effects. That idea that stability does not stay. If you access it, it's not going to be around for long. That's certainly something that I have internalized. And I think that we're going to have to address that as a generation. Like, what is this going to do for our outlook, for our voting habits, for our posture towards others, when we have really, really come to that idea that like nothing lasts?
Okay, this is hopefully a more fun question. So some people in the audience may not know, but a huge part of your background is in celebrity research and profiles and stuff. So I was wondering if you could talk about the connection between these two things. How do you see burnout portrayed in celebrity culture right now? Are there celebrities who you think are like exemplaries of what's going on, or ones who are really like downplaying the fact that most people are having to deal with burnout of some form?
Wow, great question. I mean, I follow every time that I write about a celebrity, I follow them on Instagram. And so like I have this very weird collection because some of these are celebrities that I really like, and some are ones that I have complicated relationships with. So I have a weird collection of familiarity with celebrities. I mean, the most interesting in some ways, right, is someone like and this is very recent, but like Kim Kardashian yesterday posted on her social media accounts that for her 40th birthday, Kim is also an elder millennial like myself. For her 40th birthday, she took a gathering of her closest friends and family and got them all tested, and then went to an island, right? And for like a bit of normalcy. And I get it. Like that is like we are all craving normalcy as some sort of coping mechanism to all of the stuff that's going on, but normalcy, but also something different, right? Like that's the thing for me. My life is very normal. It's the exact same freaking thing every day. Like my day is bracketed by I walk to this one view in the morning with my dogs, and then I walk to that same view in the evening with my dogs, and not a lot changes besides like what's on Twitter. And so I think that like her strategy is, well, what if I could change things for myself and for my close circle, and get the thing that I crave. But the problem with like an individualistic strategy like that, first of all, it requires incredible amounts of money, right? So it's only accessible to a very small echelon of people. And that's always the case with celebrity, but I think this is kind of a testimony to something that a lot of people have seen, which is that like, oh, safety and any sort of variance, like any sort of escape from quarantine, like that is a privilege of the rich. And then the other thing too is that someone pointed out on Twitter, like you see in the background, there are still people who are working like this catered feast on this island who have masks on, right? So this is not something like when you act in that way and when you try to prevent your own burnout, but aren't considering the ways that that has trickle down effects on all of the other people in your community, in your sphere, in your workplace, in your home, like that's not a solution in any way. So maybe that's a little too dark hearted for what we were looking for.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I that that tweet was one of the things that came up when I was wondering like who might be having
Is
that.
there anyone that you follow that you think has been doing like an interesting like commentary, kind of meta commentary on any of this?
Well, I was thinking a lot about the all of the sort of Disney Channel graduates who the gossip columnists love to obsess over. But I've seen, even the difference between how Miley's portrayed her burnouts and how Demi Lovato has portrayed her burnouts. But both, they're having these really seemingly genuine, quite distressing experiences they're going through, but then getting filtered through the branding machines that they're a part of.
Right.
Everything changes. So,
Yeah, well, and I think that anything that you try to put out there, we saw this with Chrissy Teigen and like the photos after her miscarriage. People, there is an eagerness to display, I think, oftentimes authentic gestures, authentic ways of processing trauma and grief as performative in some way,
Yeah.
right? And denigrating them for that as well.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Um, all right. Should we move to our Q&A
Yeah,
now?
let me look at these questions.
Uh,
I'll deal with this one right here that is like a just up top one is how do we know when how do you know when you hit the wall? In other words, how can you know when we should take time off? So the thing about burnout, the sort of burnout that I'm describing, and that I think all generations can have, it's just that it's particularly acute or common with millennials, is that you hit the wall and then you scale the wall and then you keep going. Right. So I think all of us during the pandemic have hit the wall in some capacity. Um, but we haven't been like, oh, well, I can take out, the number of people who are taking their PTO right now, it's just so small because what else are you going to do? You're just going to sit in the same place that you sit anyway? Are you just going to watch the same Netflix that you watch every night? Are you like, what else? There is nothing else. And that's if you have a PTO available to you. I would say that my answer to this question is that I try to identify burnout behaviors, like things that I do when I'm burnt out. The biggest one is that I struggle to read fiction. So hopefully that's like something that everyone who is attending an event like this, like if they are struggling to do the things that they really like to do, that's an intersection of oftentimes depression, right? But also a burnout thing is that you feel so tired that you can't choose the thing you want to choose, and that you resort to things like I always am just like scrolling Instagram being like, what am I doing right now? What am I doing right now? So that's more, and instead of being like, oh, well, I have to not be on social media at all, it's more of looking at the behavior, stepping back and not being judged, like not judging it, because it's not a personal failure. That's kind of what, gets you into the problem in the first place. But just really being like, well, here's what I'm doing. How can I try to like take some of the stressors off of me? What are small things that I can do? Or what are bigger conversations that I can have with people in my life that will help make some of those shifts possible? Any of these questions that you like, Rachel?
um, yeah, um, there was one, I lost it. I'm just trying to find it again. Um, oh yeah, here, there's one. Um, can you talk about what you might have come across in your research on the difference between burnout and depression? I
Mm.
had a really hard time when my son was about 2 to 4. I was working full time, sleep was still disrupted, and we were in survival mode, work, daycare, groceries. I've always said that I had postpartum depression, but the more I think about burnout, I wonder if it was just burnt out.
Yeah, I think, I am not a clinical psychologist in any capacity or a therapist, but I think they oftentimes overlap, right? Like burnout can lead to depression, depression can lead to burnout, or they just kind of are co-occurring at all times. But I think that it's important to talk about them slightly differently, because oftentimes people who are burnt out don't have some of the symptoms that people associate with depression in terms of like having difficulty, like when I was burning out and I couldn't do the things on my to-do list, like mailing packages and that sort of thing, I was still working all the time. Like I was still doing all of the things that actually mattered. It was that the more secondary things that would have benefited me were all out the window. And so I think that oftentimes sometimes depression can really be completely debilitating, whereas burnout, you are still functioning and you're just like feeling like crap while functioning all the time. But I do think that especially with parents, right? Like there is this feeling like I can't stop. I have a kid. Like there's no other decision other than to keep going at this point. And so some of the things that maybe if you don't have children, you just kind of you might be able to see it more clearly, but you're going so full throttle that like any consideration of the more finer gradations of whatever you're experiencing kind of goes away. Since retirement seems impossible as a millennial, yes, I do plan to work until I die. But the rest of the question is, what are your thoughts on trying to live more in the moment by spending money on fun activities, hobbies, instead of saving for a house or a 401k? Wow, great question. Because there's part of the millennial sensibility that is very focused on, I have to save in some capacity because because something like the pandemic is going to happen. And there isn't going to be a social safety net that is necessarily going to keep me, even if, like in Canada, there is a little bit more of a social safety net than there is in the United States. It's still not necessarily going to save me. But at the same time, you're like, well, I guess I'm going to be paying off my student loan till I die. And I'm never going to own a house. So why would I save for those things? Why don't I actually not only spend it on things that are fun or personal, but also why don't I give that money away? Like, why don't I help people who are also struggling in this moment? And I kind of think it's great in some ways. Like, I think there is this really capitalist ideology of like, we must always be working because we must always be saving to be buying things. And there's always new things to buy. And that energy is never going to be exhausted. It's just always going to be there. As soon as you think you have all the things, there's going to be a new thing that you need to have. And you're just going to need to work more. And I've been thinking a lot. I've been reading some histories of leisure and of free time. And the original American dream, it wasn't white picket fence. The original American dream was, how can we work less so that we can be with each other more? It was really like, how can we work fewer hours? And he traces it back to how like there really was this idea that with automation and mechanization and modernity and in the late 19th century and early 20th century, people were like, the American dream might be changed. Like, we might be getting there. We are going to work fewer hours. Like, what if we actually worked only 6 hours a day, which was actually implemented in a lot of places in the United States. And then it all went to crap, right? Because people figured out, instead of, oh, we can work fewer hours and still make more things, they figured out, oh, well, we can work the same amount of hours or even more hours and make even more things, because we have to aspire to this idea of perpetual growth. So yeah, part of me is thinking a lot about what does it mean and what does it look like to live a life that is guided by less compunction to work, by less compunction to save, and by more investment in ourselves and our communities.
Can I follow up that with asking what your take is on the FIRE movement? I think it stands for financially independent, retire early, and it's kind of this weird hybrid of like, make as much money as you can, but only because you can do it really fast, and then retire at like 40.
Right.
But yeah.
So I think I feel the same way about the FIRE community as I do about what's his name, who wrote the 4-Hour Work Week. So I've been reading that book and a lot of other kind of recent books about work and about lifestyle, because I'm working on my next book with my partner, who is a tech writer for the New York Times, about working from home and like all of the problems it presents, but also maybe some of the more radical or liberatory components. But so the 4-Hour Work Week, the idea is basically that he he employs really cheap assistant labor from overseas to take off all of the work that is like quote unquote menial, like basically like managing his inbox, all that sort of thing. He's like, how can I find someone who I can pay pennies to do this? And then he also offloads all sorts of other things onto other people. So the way that he only works 4 hours a week is by making more work for other people, right? And so I think in some ways, if you are one of these people who is like, how can I make so much money? How do you make a lot of money? Oftentimes by working in industries that are incredibly exploitative, right? Or doing things that are ethically or morally dubious. And then oftentimes they are only calculating for a retirement that can support them and them alone, right? It's not a way of thinking about like, how can I continue to be a contributing member of my society, right? You still pay taxes, but like, are you actually going to be generating enough so that you can donate to causes that are really important to you? Like, are you going to be able to help out other people in your community through mutual aid and that sort of thing? Like, it it just seems like a pretty individual solution to a social problem.
Totally.
But great
Um,
question.
so, someone wants to know, how has the digital shift of social media and online networking affected millennials? And do you see a split down gender lines?
So it's interesting. I think that like I've been thinking a lot about email. My last newsletter was all about email and how I am of an age where I can still remember when email was a delight. Like I opened up my email and it was all friends. It was like flirting, long jokes, clever long letters from friends. It was much more of a craft and it was much more of a site of leisure instead of work in a box on your computer. And just like work has infiltrated so many other corners of our lives, including our phones and um, our domestic spaces through laptops and phones and Wi-Fi. That's what's happened with email as well. And that's also what's happened with our social networking, right? Like I don't, there's no way to delineate work friends versus non-work friends on Facebook. Like I know some people who maybe try to like not follow work people on Instagram or keep their Instagram private to people that they work with or their bosses, that sort of thing. It's really hard. It requires a lot of work. But these places, for someone who, let's say for the bookstore, is running their social media, every time they open their own Instagram account, they are also thinking about all the things that they need to do for the bookstore's Instagram account. They're so intermingled, and that makes it really hard to cultivate any sort of divide between workspaces and leisure spaces. And I think that's just largely indicative of like the overall difficulty in separating work from the rest of our lives. It's so hard.
Oh, absolutely. Probably about 50% of the Instagram accounts I follow are book related. And I'm interested, I'm a bookseller because I love books. I'm interested in books. And then also when I'm looking at these recommendations for books I might want to read in my downtime, I'm like, ooh, do we have that at the store? Should we sell it? Can I
Right.
order it? Um, so there's no, I think also, so I joined Facebook in high school, and I think I was on Facebook for about 2 weeks before people started saying, well, make sure you're really careful because your future employers might see what you're posting on Facebook. So like this space that was supposed to be a fun space, I think I was primed very early on to see it as, and how am I presenting myself? I was worried about what my employers thought about being on my Facebook before I even had a resume to give to someone.
Yeah, well, and that's such a great point that I actually have never thought about, but it really fits in with a lot of the messaging to millennials that they started receiving. I didn't receive it as much just because of where I grew up, which is in rural Idaho, and um, there wasn't a huge like prestigious college push. But like, I think people who are even just a little bit younger started hearing like everything that you do is something that could potentially be on your resume at a very young age. And there's this shift towards what's called concerted cultivation, is the word that childhood scholars call it, which uh, there's a lot of great things about concerted cultivation, but it's also kind of just like rearing your kids as mini adults and also thinking of their lives as parts of a resume. So even something as simple as turning unstructured child directed play into a play date, right? Like of course you're not going to put a play date on a resume, but it also is something that is oftentimes instrumentalized in order to like make this the right sort of connections. Like even if parents aren't thinking about it, there's a great book about this by Dr. Tamara Mose called The Play Date. But if you are also instructed that like your socializing sphere is a way that you are preparing yourself for the workplace, like what space of your life isn't work prep, right? Like, and you're taught that at a very young age, it has long-term effects on your ability to separate work and leisure.
Mhm. I was thinking when I was preparing my questions also about the Babysitters Club books, which are making a comeback now with the new Netflix shows, is also very exemplary of this trend. You know, here's a group of kids that gets together and says, what if instead of playing after school, we started a company?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. It was so aspirational. Like I was so obsessed with the Babysitters Club. I was like, this is exactly what I want. I want my babysitting to be part of a corporation, and I want a president, and I want all these different people. I oftentimes think of Babysitters Club when I am thinking about my research into boomers in the 1980s and like the burnout that boomers experienced, because the first time that I heard about a workaholic, it was Stacy's dad was a workaholic. And that's part of the reason why like her parents got divorced, and that she had some ideas about work and that sort of thing, and gender and work that were never like super explicit commentary, but it was also just like a sign of the fact that this was something that a lot of millennial kids were growing up with, millennial and late or young Gen Xers, is dealing with a parent that is a workaholic and has that relationship to work. There's a question here. Did it go away? I saw it just a little bit ago. Huh. Well, the question was, it was about basically like, do you think, what role do millennials play in perpetuating our own burnout? And this is a really hard one, right? Because it's kind of like internalized misogyny. Is that like, yes, of course. Like we are all responsible for a lot of the actions and habits and postures that make burnout a cycle that's really hard to break, right? We are not without agency. But I also think that one of the things that sometimes gets discounted is just how powerful an ideological force the systems that we've been operating, like the ideologies that we've been operating in are so powerful and were presented as very common sense. And depending on your personality and your posture towards dominant ideologies, I was a pleaser. I wanted to follow the path. I thought that that was the way to do it. And I thought that if I did everything, like if I knew every obstacle on the path and knew the strategies for overcoming it, then I would reach stability, happiness, whatever those things are that we dream of as aspiring adults. And I wish that I had asked more questions. I wish that I had asked questions about the realities of academia, the realities of student debt, the purposes of stability, like just stability, just generally, like what are we actually seeking? I wish I'd interrogated all of it, and I didn't. And I'm doing it now, but it has been a long time fighting those ideas in my head. It took a long time to arrive at that point. Like the idea that I had been building towards burnout since I was 25 and didn't write that article until I was 38, 37, right? That's a long process. So I do think that there is a halfway point between like acknowledging the ways that we perpetuate some of the things that suck, right? Like this is with patriarchy too. Like a lot of us who are feminists perpetuate patriarchy. A lot of us who think of ourselves as anti-racist perpetuate racism and racial hierarchies. And so how can you acknowledge your agency within this and work hard to make some of those personal changes that continue to keep that that larger ideology in place. Like, how can you fight that? But also not feel bad about the fact that like you can't do it by yourself, right? Like there were paths set out for us, and our parents and our peers and our mentors and our teachers, and lots of different the movies that we watched, lots of different things were reinforcing the idea that like this is the path that you could follow. And so it's understandable that we believe that was the case. But now, together, we can try to change that path, right? We can actually try to make change that will make it not such of a struggle for people to come or for our peers today.
Great, thanks so much. We have time for one more short question. I'm seeing one about young people moving or trying to move away from the cities and towards the suburbs or less populated areas. And this is something you did not so long ago, I believe. And they're asking how does this intersect with our concepts of community and ambition, as we're seeing it play out again.
Oh, so many interesting things going on, right? Because I think that like over the course of millennials' adulthoods, cities became a handful of major cities became like the place you needed to be if you wanted to have a certain sort of job. And so lots and lots of people moved to these cities, even though they couldn't afford them, even though they were living in cramped living conditions or overextending themselves or taking on debt to live there. And not getting paid very well because they wanted to be in certain professions, and those professions were centered in these high cost living areas, and there was no other option. So what I think work from home has done to some capacity is shifted that, right? To be like, oh, well, maybe you could do this work from other places. And if you're someone like me, like it's not that I didn't like New York where I lived when I worked at BuzzFeed. New York is a wonderful, like everything that people say about New York is true, like every single thing, because it's many things to many people. But I also, like, I grew up in North Idaho. Like, that is my landscape. The Mountain West and like not a lot of people is what I like. And I am a better reporter out there because I know the people and the people will talk to me. Like, it is a nourishing place to me. And we should have people in all industries who are coming from different backgrounds. And that means obviously different racial and experiential backgrounds, but also different geographic backgrounds, and living in the places and seeing the people that their work is affecting in one way or another. At the same time, if you're making a city salary and you move to these places, like your movement into these places is having effects on people. It is having demonstrable effects on what people in those places can afford. And we're seeing this especially in Montana right now, because lots of people are moving in and displacing people who can't afford to live there anymore. And so I think that like there's that issue, but then also if you're living in a smaller place, if you're not in the city and like hustling all the time, how does it open up space to actually build community? And so that's part of the thesis of the new book that we're working on is like, okay, if you're working from home, one potential is that you just work all the time and any line between work and non-work gets decimated. Another possibility is maybe you don't have all this time wasted with just like presentism and your butt in the chair and the commute, and you figure out how to work really efficiently in fewer hours. And then that opens you up to actually participating in your community, to being more present with your family, to having a hobby, all sorts of things that I think are the way forward in terms of cultivating a real and vibrant self that is not just your work self.
All right, thanks so much. So we're going to wrap up. I'll just remind everyone that this lovely book that we've been discussing all evening can be yours I encourage you to order it from us, Drawn and Quarterly, who have hosted the event tonight, as well as any other books that you're looking to read, but especially this one. It's an excellent read. It would make a great Christmas gift. It is absolutely not too early for holiday shopping with our very delayed mail delivery systems that we're all experiencing. Yeah, and thank you so much once again to Anne for this very generous conversation. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. Wonderful questions. I really appreciated it.
Okay, have a great evening, everyone.